Okay, welcome to the Hope City Drip. This is a podcast of Hope City Church where Ben and I are going to talk through things pertaining to our church life, our actual local church life, and we hope that this is designed for anybody who is on the go, anybody who's living a modern life, which is most people. You're a stay-at-home mom, or whether you're a shift worker, you have weird rhythms in your schedule, and you just can't sit and digest a big piece of systematic theology, or even a big long blog or something. We just hope that this is a way you can digest at least our mission and vision of our local church, and that this would be helpful for you to live for the glory of Jesus and the joy of our local community here in Clinton. And on this podcast, I really want to talk and continue to riff on how we can live out Jesus's vision for the good life, and in particular, how we can live that out here in Clinton, Iowa. I feel like this podcast isn't going to be helpful for anybody, even us, if we don't bring it to the ground.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? How can we actually live this out? And so this week, the sermon this week, the text that we were preaching on was in the Sermon on the Mount, in the section right following the Beatitudes. And it's Jesus's famous sayings where he says to the believers, to those following him, he says, "You're salt and you're light." And really one of the applications from that text is that as salty believers, as people that are useful and tasty and really just examples of living God's flourishing life in this community. One of the hallmarks of the church who is salt and light in a community is that they are people of joy.
Yeah.
That they actually even though we're living on the heels of a pandemic, people are just frustrated with job changes and just regular difficulties of life. People who have the Holy Spirit and the presence of God living in them have the gift of joy that surpasses circumstances. And so I think it's very real to say, wouldn't it be fair to say that a Christian church that is a salt and light church is a church that's good at encouragement or good at celebration? And one of the things I noticed, and I want you to speak into this a little bit, because I'm comfortable with applying my own circumstances to my experience in Clinton, but I want to hear from somebody else. I grew up hearing a lot of negativity in Clinton, whether it's that business or whatever factory that closed its doors and offshored, or whether it's that family that, used to be really prominent in the community and then they left, or whether it's Riverboat Days, rest in peace. It left. And
I was doing okay.
Yeah, I know. I ripped open this big wound there. Festering wound that just never healed. So there's a lot of reasons we can be discouraged. And where was I going with that? I hear a lot of negativity growing up that, we lost so much population. Clinton isn't what it used to be in the 70s. And I hear that, not all the time, but I hear it a decent amount. And it's just this quiet understanding of we live in Clinton. Mm-hmm. This isn't where the best stuff happens. And yet you read the scriptures and it seems like in God's kingdom, that's where the best stuff happens. So if we're to be living a salt and light church experience, then at least in the church, in our church life, people in Clinton who are used to experiencing negativity, that should be jarring. It should be like a countercultural, whoa, I heard growing up that this is a negative place to live in, but then I'm at church and I'm with people in church and I'm doing church things in community. It seems like there's a lot of life here. I don't know. Was your experience growing up a lot of negativity in this place?
Yeah, it's just a lot of cynicism, dwelling on, like you said, dwelling on the past and what things aren't anymore, or driving by. I guess I would always hear my parents, my family talk about GPS or navigationally, based on businesses that were.
Right.
That's Timmy's skateboard shop. I remember as a kid going in there and and just take a left at Timmy's.
Up by the old Gills Ballroom.
Yep.
Gills. It's been Gills for 2 decades, like stuff like that.
But so yeah, just a lot of like what was. I guess when you were talking, I was just thinking we should, if you want to put context in and people are listening, what we're referencing as far as what it means to be salt.
Yeah.
Because I think being light is a well-used saying that people kind of understand the generalness of that.
Yeah.
But what's it mean when we're talking about being salt?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The most simple way to put it is that salt was useful in the ancient world as it is today. And so at the very least, people who are salty are useful in this world. They're useful in preserving. They're useful in providing flavor. So when Jesus says that you're salt, he's saying you guys are useful in this world that I've made. And a layer deeper than that is that salt was referenced in some of the rituals, worship rituals in the Old Testament. And salt was referenced in connection with covenant faithfulness. So in Numbers, I believe it was, there is, in Leviticus 2:13, I remember that. Leviticus 2:13, there is a command to put salt with the grain offerings. Mm-hmm. And then also in Numbers, there is a reference to a covenant of salt forever. And so salt is this symbol of not only preservation in general, but specifically preservation of God's covenant to renew and remake all that he made good that had become broken because of sin, but that he has pledged to, I will one day bring this all, restored. It will be all restored one day. And what he does, Jesus, what he's saying is that it's through you, it's through the church that God's covenant renewal happens through, which is a really cool, I think it's a really fascinating idea, is that, I'm not just a part of a church in general. I'm like a part of God's mission to remake the world. He's using me as a conduit, like for his presence to restore and remake and all that. And so I just think that that's a really helpful way to think through things in Clinton, thinking about brokenness all the time. Part of our responsibility and privilege as Christians who are salt is that we are in Clinton in such a time as this, right? We're here for a reason to do some good, to restore and to rebuild. And I think that is right in line with what God's designed the church to function as. Yeah. So I don't know, what are some things that come to mind when you think of, preservation or restoration in Clinton?
I guess just using kind of the common idea of all the broken down buildings and abandoned buildings and finding new use for them. I know there's what's going down on Fifth Avenue in downtown. They're buying up those old buildings and that's cool. Celebrate that. That's awesome. I don't really know what they're doing, with them. I'm not saying that they're doing anything bad. I don't know what their plans are and stuff, but they're trying. Right. If we're going to be celebrating, I think you celebrate attempts rather than you just celebrate the major victories. You just celebrate people trying. Right. And support them in that. Right.
Yeah. This, I think, relates to a friend of mine served at a church for a long time with us, and not our church, but a different church that I was a part of. A friend of mine, he's not from Iowa, and he moved up here with his family to help this church, serve the church, love the church. He gave himself up for this church, and he's now wrestling with moving back to his home state, where his family is from, and the in-laws are there, and he's got little kids, and I know that he's wrestling with feeling like he's bailing on the church here in Iowa. And it's totally not, that's not bailing. You've given your life for this countercultural move of trying to bring salvation to lost people and trying to renew broken places and relationships. And it's man, just being a part of the mission of God is we need to celebrate that.
Absolutely.
I've heard of another church in Florida, I think. I'm pretty sure it's the Tampa Underground, but I'm not really sure. in Florida, there's a church where they do a lot of like, they call them micro churches, where, you think of church as like, all right, let's get everybody, like 100, 200, 300, whatever people together in one room, and that's our church. Every Sunday we do that. Well, they do a thing called micro churches, which is more like what people would think of in like small group home groups, and they call that a church. So everyone comes together in their home group, and it's a huge city. It's in Tampa, and so it makes more sense. They live in neighborhoods that are more densely populated, and they have like a mission, like a particular problem they're trying to solve in an area of the city, whether it's sex trafficking or poverty or hunger, homelessness. And so their church will go out into the city and try to reach people, not only lost people who don't know Jesus and try to save souls, but also try and like alleviate real, tangible poverty issues and things like that. And so any church that tries to do that, but then doesn't like make it, so to speak, they bring them up before the entire group of all these other churches, and they celebrate them.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so they're like, well done, great, good job for trying. And that's not a participation trophy. It's like, this is real life or death soul work, you know? And so anyways, I think celebration, that stuck out to me. And that's stuck out to me since becoming a pastor, actually, is the role celebration has in the life of the local church, and celebrating not just stuff that happens in our church, but also stuff that happens outside of the church, like in our city. Can we celebrate stuff that's going on in our city? And I think that's hard in Clinton.
Yeah.
At least it's hard for me. I'm just going to speak for myself. I've let it seep into my bones, the negativity, the just not giving the benefit of the doubt. Like, oh, this is probably not going to work. This new restaurant or whatever. So I don't know. What do you think is like there in my heart? Why do I'm prone to do that?
It's like a stain of tradition, of just what we grew up in. I think anyone from Clinton understands that. As much as we hate it, and like we live here and like we want all these things, but and like, oh no, like, oh, you know who owns that business? You know, that's not gonna make it. You know,
Right.
It's just like small town gossip that just leads into cynicism over everything. And then once we do get a cool thing that was probably cool 10 years ago in a bigger city, then we all criticize that too. It's just a negative stain, I think, on our. We don't have a habit of celebration.
A habit of celebration. So how do we cultivate a habit of celebration? Like how can we as a local church cultivate a habit of celebration?
Start small.
Yeah.
I think just noticing and celebrating the little things. I think we talked about this in the encouragement podcast, but so even like the couple in our church that are redoing their house or remodeling their house.
Yeah, Josh. I actually want him on the podcast because I think he'd be.
Oh yeah.
He's got a huge heart for Clinton and restoration, but he also, I think, understands. You know, he's worked as a welder, and you know, he's worked in a lot of the factories around town, and so I've never worked in most of these places around Clinton because I've spent most of my working life, you know, in Cedar Falls where I went to college and stuff, and so he actually has a better insight into the day-to-day grind of working life in Clinton, and so I think I respect his vantage point because he's still trying to do the work of restoration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, just celebrating them and you know their work of creating, you know, just rebuilding and the sacrifices they're making to do this for their family, and which also in that neighborhood, I'm not too familiar with the neighborhood, but it's also bringing restoration to that neighborhood, just one house at a time.
Right.
So yeah, definitely great job, Josh.
Yeah. 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 Great job.
And Anna.
Oh yeah. Anna's a warrior. She's doing the heavy lifting with the kids and being a mom and putting up with his constant working. I mean, my wife has to do the same thing. I'm like, babe, we gotta work on this house project, and then she's like, okay, and she watches the kids, has to put them to bed by herself, all that.
Good job, Holly.
Yeah, I can hear her now putting the kids to bed.
2 snaps for Holly.
Yeah, I think another way. Yeah, dude, I love that. Celebrate the little wins. Cultivating a culture of celebration and encouragement. I think I've noticed this with myself is that I believe every act of genuine encouragement and celebration of others is an act of self-denial.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't know if you've noticed that. There's, like, even celebrating Josh, you know, I have an old house. I like working on my house. And I like to restore my neighborhood, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so for me to say, hey, look at this dude, is by default me getting someone else to look at someone else, not me. And I think that takes a lot of guts, and I think it takes a lot of sacrifice to be like, okay, you know, this person is worth your attention, and not drawing it to me. So, and I think that's hard to cultivate in a community where there's the posture of, I want to celebrate this other person in my community.
I think that's also like a sign of the Spirit's work in
Yes.
you through your work in the disciplines and everything, and your time with God, is that your willingness to deny yourself and look for celebrating someone else.
Yeah, you do a great job of that too. Not to like just spend our time patting each other on the back, but it's something that I've noticed God working when I feel like that's something I can put my finger on and say that's God. Because when I read the New Testament, there's a lot of emphasis on unity within a church body, and there's so much disunity going on in the world. It's obvious, you know. There's so many issues people are fighting over. But when you see people encouraging one another in a spirit of love and patience, it's like, man, that's so countercultural, you know. And that church is a light to go dive back into the Beatitudes. It's like, that's a real win, you know. I mean, we can scoff at that and say, well, that's not very much.
Yeah.
But in reality, I mean, how many people are, I don't know who's listening to this, but I guarantee you that you can probably think of more people who are divisive in your life than you can of people who are genuinely bringers of peace, unity, celebration, encouragement. So I don't know. I think it's interesting. And I think Jesus is uniquely good at that. You know, like we see his work in the New Testament, and he just knows the broken, going towards the broken and giving them encouragement and new life. And so it just does make sense, because one other thing, I don't know if you've noticed this in yourself, is when you're around a lot of negativity, it becomes easier to actually identify, like make yourself stand out by saying what you're not, you know, like for example, like if I said, I can't think of a concrete example. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. I'm not like this person. I don't know, like Clinton. If I were to pitch Clinton, well, it's not California. You know, as fun as that is to say, that still doesn't say what we are.
Yeah.
You know, or even put it in Christian terms. Well, I don't drink alcohol. I don't go to parties. Well, what? Well, then what are you? You know? And so Christ calls us into a relationship with him where he's, you know, leading us to become more like himself. And so have you noticed that tendency in yourself? Like part of the negativity cycle?
Yeah. It's easier to stem into negativity in that circle of gossip and negative self-talk, or, you know, all that stuff. But that brings up an idea for how do we create a culture or an environment of celebration. And I think we start looking at our city and our communities as what they are, you know. And even if it's just, you can only think of, if you're just trying to get out of that negative, you know, cycle, just think of like one thing. You know, it's kind of like those, have you ever seen or heard of the like self-esteem journaling, where like you write down 3 affirmations every day, or like, I am cool, I am neat, you know.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like you write these things down, and that's like, it's just to like
Sure.
switch your mind, so you're not focusing on like, I suck, and like, you know, it's like, but I think doing that for our city as well, like if you have to write them down, if you don't tell anyone, but just, what do I love about Clinton, or what is Clinton? Clinton is blank.
Right.
And try and just think of something every day, something new. And it'll just open your mind, probably. Like eventually it's going to start opening your mind to what's going on, and just to be able to celebrate who we are. Because we're not a lot of things. We're not Des Moines. You know, we're not a big city. We're not going to have all these fancy things like a lot of big cities have that are cool and hip. but we're Clinton and we're a small town, and you can raise a family here. You can get a house for pretty cheap, except for right now in this market. But,
Yeah.
it's just like, what are we?
Yeah.
And start focusing on that and celebrate those things rather than always just looking out into the horizon and just wishing you were somewhere else.
So how have you done that for yourself? Like, how do you know who you are? In dark seasons of your life, when you've doubted and you've been in places where you've had negative self-talk or even self-hatred, self-loathing, like, how do you know who you really are?
I'm very blessed and have people in my life that remind me of things, of who I am and who I'm not. Yes, the child of God, like you are. I don't say that like lightly. But like if I get really down on myself and I'm just a nobody, or I'm just an anxious person, blah blah blah, like, and these people know me well enough that they know when I'm thinking these things when I don't, and they just like know when to speak into me. So I'm very blessed in that, but also it's just for me, I guess I recognize and know who I am just through experience. I think I had to go to Austin and like go through a lot of crap and just see who I came out on the other side to know like, hey, I still am like, I went through this tough situation, a tough breakup, or, an ending of a friendship or whatever. But I know that I'm still a kind person. I know that I'm still able to love other people, love other friends, love neighbors. Like that is not my identity, is that brokenness. It just, and then I think when you start going through those dark cycles and your identity's kind of shaken, you start to like want to get back to it, and it's like, oh, I enjoy complimenting people. Well, I think I'm going to start doing that again. That's just not an unnatural thought to want to start doing something, that. So I think eventually you start kind of kicking yourself out of the rut.
So how do you, so make it clear for people who maybe don't know, like, how do you claim those, like, where do you go? Like, where would someone go to know who they are, their identity? Like a God follower, like, because you mentioned people tell you things, but I would imagine that people aren't always right. So, I mean, where do you go to really know what your identity is?
This sounds cliche, but like scripture.
Yeah.
I guess for me, more so prayer.
It's a good cliche.
It is
because it's like right.
Probably for me in those situations when I'm in those seasons, I'm really hurried and really rushed, and I'm not sitting still and meditating on my thoughts. So the time that I do calm myself, I'm able to just like recognize my thoughts and like pray over them, and like God just kind of reminds me of who He calls me to be and who He says I am, and the gifts and the skill set that He's given me.
What place in Scripture would you say has been uniquely like speaks to you? Like this is a section I go back to often when I need reminded of what God says about me.
Psalms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the Psalms?
They're not all like rainbows and butterflies. They're like David saying that he messed up a billion times, and he's praying to God to restore him. And he's, there's other times where he's thanking God for the things that He's given him and the skills that He's given him. And, other psalmists, not just David, but, so it's just really relatable in every generation. It's not just something from, when David was living in BC days, but it's like to now.
Right. Yeah. That's really good. I think that it's safe to say a lot of people are wrestling through like the negativity of self-talk. And I think that that's probably unique or heightened in our generation. I think maybe, I don't know if this is true, but I think it is that 40s and above probably don't use that type of psychological language. They mostly talk about, I don't like this place. I don't like my job. I don't like my couch, but I like the TV shows that I watch or what, I don't know. It's a lot more like, here's my actual experience, And whereas I feel like I had a conversation with a guy today, And this is not a unique conversation. So if this person's listening, I'm not throwing you under the bus. I'm saying I understand you because I'm sympathizing with you, and I hear a lot of other people say these things. But I asked the guy if he would consider himself post-evangelical. And he asked me what that meant to me. And I said, well, from my understanding, post-evangelical is a person who's grown up in sort of this culturally Christian, basically nominal evangelical church context, and has experienced a lot of disruptions in the world, like the divisive political election cycle and COVID and the various responses to that. And just a lot of the, there's been a lot of things in our like media that we consume that is very disillusioning. You know, it's like there's a lot of cultural baggage with the church right now that I think a lot of people are vomiting out.
Yeah.
And I've seen the way that pushes people go into this cycle of negativity where the whole church is so negative, and it's exhausting to be around people. It's exhausting to be in church in general because it's not a life-giving celebratory place. It's divisive and politicized. And you know, even like the whole mask thing, like, you know, like for the longest time, like during this pandemic, it's part of not going to church is, am I going to get harassed for wearing a mask, or am I going to get harassed for not wearing a mask? And is that, so people don't want to, just to put it like bluntly, they don't want to mess with that negativity. They don't want that bad vibe. And it's a shame because the church is to be a refuge of joy in the midst of bad circumstances. I mean, it's been that way in all of Scripture. Is like 1 Peter, there was literal persecution and really heavy stuff going on in the church, and it wasn't just a pandemic. It was like state-sanctioned executions and violence towards Christians for being Christian. And we weren't experiencing that, but we're experiencing hemorrhaging numbers leaving the church, you know, everywhere in America. And people aren't coming back. There's so many people that just aren't coming back. And so it's just not a typical association for people to make, to say, oh, you were part of a local church? Probably a really great place to be. That's very celebratory, full of joy. You know, their first thought is, that sounds exhausting. And I don't want to be there.
I don't agree with you.
Yeah. So
I think so this is kind of a sidebar.
Yeah.
I just was thinking of it. Back onto how do we be celebratory? I think we celebrate people who, you know, are countercultural and stick to God's commands and follow, I don't want to say the law, but, you know, like, are godly people. You know,
yeah, or obedient to Jesus.
Obedient, yes, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I was just talking about this with some friends this weekend about high schoolers and how you don't see many high schoolers stay with the faith if they got like saved in like youth group or something like that, and then through college and last, you know, and actually stay and not just like casually, like where like, you know, like stay and then fall out and like, but call themselves, you know what I mean? Like, like biblical,
like resilient
biblical
disciples of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's like, we should celebrate, not just like, I mean, celebrate kids for that. Cause I can't, like, that's hard. I lived in that generation. I wasn't a Christian at that age, but I can only imagine the amount of pressure. But celebrate them, celebrate the adults that are like Josh, he's out in the workplace where it's a hard environment to be a disciple of Jesus, and he's doing it every day, and he's trying his best to encourage and love his coworkers. Yes.
Right.
Like, celebrate those people that are doing that.
Right.
And then I think that just allows us to be that light, and people can see how we're building up each other. But it's not just like, it's a very specific type of encouragement. Like, yeah, we want to celebrate someone that's like, you know, don't just go hate people, but like, not just like love is love and like, okay, yeah, like peace, brother. But like, we're celebrating being a disciple.
Yeah.
And we're celebrating what the Spirit is doing in our lives.
That's right. Yeah.
And celebrating what that is, the outflow of that.
Right.
Of what we can, how us being conduits.
Right. So Yeah, let me wear my pastor hat for just a second. Is that if someone is listening to this and is like, hey, are you saying, because, okay, so this is not a throwing under the bus thing. So I think it's 94.7. What's that? What's the radio station? We play everything.
I think Mac 94.
Mac 94.7. Yeah. That radio station does an incredible job at celebrating little things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why people want to listen to it. You know, it's like, it's good content, but it's good content because they're really intentional with, I think it's Chris Street. He bringing on local people who are doing local businesses, running local initiatives, and just celebrating the little wins. Like that's what a coach does.
Yeah.
A great coach celebrates little wins. And he's doing exactly what you described, is cultivating a culture of celebration through celebrating the little things first. And that stuff's contagious. I was doing my physical therapy every Tuesday, Thursday until recently. And so for months, I'm listening to, in the therapist's office, Mac 94.7, and he's having people on talking about antique, shopping at antique malls and starting selfie studios and all stuff. And it's stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think is like really big stuff, but it's cool. You're right. It's worth celebrating people trying. But I think someone listening to this might think, well, why do I need the church then? Why do I need Jesus? Like, are you just saying peace and love and positive vibes and just like think happy thoughts? Like, how is what our community is doing any different than, let's just say, a book club that gets together and says, we want to celebrate good literature and history in Clinton. You know what I mean? Or a coffee shop.
I think the uniqueness with having the Christian aspect with it is it's not categorical. So it's like a book club wants to celebrate literature, or a coffee shop wants to celebrate coffee. Like Christian, like we're celebrating the kingdom, and everything is in the kingdom.
Oh yeah. Like I like that. I didn't think about that. The kingdom. Yeah. Jesus is over the world, right? This is all of this is his.
So what makes, why should I, if I can just do this non-Christian? Well, it's going to be a lot harder for you to have your eyes open to something that you're not normally wanting to do.
Mm-hmm.
And have a genuine love for it. Not saying it can't happen, but I think that's where the Spirit of God comes in, opens our eyes to see more of what he's doing in the city, region, world. Is a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think too is that this can become, you kind of slipped and said law when you were talking about trying to describe obedience, but I think that was a good slip because what I think, my mind drifts to the gospel when I think about these things, like gospel-centered celebration, for example. Gospel-centered celebration has to come out of an understanding that we, apart from Christ, can't be positive enough.
Yeah.
It's like we're dead on the inside and the world is dead. And it's like, there's actually just too much decay in Clinton to just be positive and see everything. Just put a smile on and then, because there's some real nasty decay here. Mm-hmm. Whether it's architectural or family or whatever brokenness, it's just a lot of decay. And it's like, I can't just put a plastic face on and then it'll be better. So there has to be some supernatural intervention. And so for me, I always have to come back to Jesus transferred me from the kingdom of, let's just say negativity, but the kingdom of darkness and evil and death, and put me into the kingdom of light by grace and grace alone. And so that spiritual transformation from dark to light to death to life, like that has to happen before we can even meaningfully encourage anyone in the small things. And I have to remember that, because otherwise I'm running out under my own strength and doing things like, I'm just going to say good job, buddy, to my neighbor for mowing his lawn or something. I don't know. I don't ever say that to my neighbor for mowing his lawn. Good job, buddy. I generally try not to call my middle-aged neighbor buddy, just for the record.
Chief.
But the source of my joy, I want him to see that as Christ. I want him to see Jesus. And I believe that he will see that clearest if he sees my own brokenness and how Christ redeemed that through the cross. And so it's hard because I want to celebrate the little things and all that, but I want to be used as a conduit for the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ going to the world. And I think that's what separates for me as I think through, like, because even my favorite coffee shop, 392, says be the light. Well, like, is good coffee the gospel? Is good conversation the gospel? Of course not. Like, that's at best, that's just like good vibes. But at worst, it's legalism because, once that coffee shop stops producing a product that's up to the standards of the customer, then people stop coming and they cease being the light. And that's not what they're trying to convey. They're trying to convey that the coffee's is pushing you beyond just the cup of coffee. But it's a business, whereas church is not. Like, we don't deal in that economy. Like, Christ is coming to people in a different way, like by grace, and it's a far greater problem than just like, I need caffeine. It's like, I need life to my dead bones. So yeah, that would be my encouragement for anybody listening, is like.
So this reminds me of, I was thinking of Paul. So like, the reason why we need Christ is before he was encountered by Jesus, he was celebrating persecution.
Yeah.
And he was celebrating these horrible things. And, might need your seminary skill on this one to really sharpen this out, but probably was living a high life. He was a high scholar, well respected.
Yeah. True.
Leading this persecution train, met Jesus, totally sees a flip side of the kingdom of celebrating these people that are dying to spread the good news, celebrating the littlest things and supporting and encouraging people and living into that, and not just like sitting up on his high horse, but being right in the middle of it with them and seeing and recognizing and knowing, but pointing it all back to the gospel and pointing it all back to Christ and saying, it's all for this. This is why we're doing this. This is why I can do this. And I'm nothing. Like, I need Christ to see this.
Right. Yeah, the fascinating thing about that is that he goes from celebrating other people's misery to celebrating God's work in him through his own misery. The whole book of 2 Corinthians is about his suffering that has produced a greater testimony to God's work and authority in his life. And that's crazy. And I think that's what brings Christian celebration like up a level where we have an opportunity, and not saying we do this by our own strength or own savvy, but we have an opportunity to have even greater impact in this community, far greater impact than just good vibes, because people can see our, like, for example, this is what's sinister about the prosperity gospel, is that if I'm rich and have a nice car and have a bunch of food and have a like good looking family and all that, well, the discouraged will look at that and they'll go, well, duh. Of course he's happy and can celebrate things because his life is good. He has nothing wrong. Whereas if they see me, an average Joe, just struggling with the rest of the folks, and I'm like exuberant in Christ, well, that speaks a different testimony of the power of the Spirit working in me. And so I think that's why you see in the scriptures when the church is most, when the thumb of oppression or bad circumstances or the enemy or anyone, like all this, when it gets bad and tough, the joy of the Lord is more apparent. And that's why I do believe that Clinton is ripe for the good work of the church, the renewing work of the church in this town, because it's so apparent. The contrast is so distinct. Like, man, these guys, like this church, these churches, like God, Jesus's work in a broken community can be that much more famous and demonstrated. So I'm incredibly optimistic and hopeful that our church can join and is joining the work Jesus is already doing through the church, through other churches in this community.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Do you have anything to add on how our church can tangibly participate in celebrating? And
I think just pray and ask God to open your eyes to people and things that need to be celebrated, or not necessarily need to be, but can be. And just pay attention to the small things. I think with Christian celebration, it's not just like we're throwing a big party for like Johnny at the office that, got his license or passed his test or something. We're throwing a big thing and like after hours party, and it's like, okay. And then you just move on with regular life. It's probably a smaller celebration. It's me walking up to someone after church and being like, hey, like I've seen like the work you're doing on your tables that you build in your spare time. That's awesome. Or I've seen like your work that you do at the food pantry. That's so cool. Congratulations. Like, keep it up. That's awesome. That's really awesome. It's going to be probably a little more subtle celebrations.
Yeah. And then pray that they follow the thread. They follow the breadcrumbs. And they're like, why is this dude's joy? Why is he celebrating me? I don't understand. Why is this guy so positive? And then he follows the trail of breadcrumbs back to the Holy Spirit. He's like, oh, that's why. It's God. God's with this person. Yeah. Well, I feel like that's good. We'll pick this topic up. I felt like it's good to have freedom to explore some of I was just interested in what you had to say about negativity and celebration and how you've wrestled through that. We should explore that again in a future podcast, because ultimately the Sermon on the Mount that we're going through, that we're trying to riff off of with this podcast, is Jesus is laying a vision for flourishing out. Flourishing is not typically what I associate with Clinton when I was younger. I thought flourishing happened everywhere else except here. And so I think a lot of people are still in that place of like, how do I actually flourish in this town? Jesus does have an answer. And so I want to continue to just plunge into that question. How can we flourish in Clinton? How can we flourish in Clinton? Celebration, big piece of that. And that has to come as an outflow of the Spirit. So whether you're, a part of our local church or not, and you're listening from a distance, we just hope that this is helpful for you to live for the glory of Jesus and the joy of your local community.